Baby discovered a bear cub hidden in a pharmacy storage. What he did next amazed customers. The afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the wooden floor of Marshall's Pharmacy, a place that had stood on the corner of Oak Street for nearly 50 years. The old building carried the comforting smell of dried lavender and peppermint, mixed with the faint scent of polished wood that had been rubbed smooth by countless hands over the decades. Ethan Marshall stood behind the counter, his weathered hands carefully arranging small glass bottles on a shelf, while he spoke in soft tones with Lily Morgan, one of his regular customers. She had come in looking for something to help with her mother's arthritis, and as always, Ethan took his time explaining each option with the patience of someone who truly cared about the people who walked through his door. Little Connor, barely a year old, with wispy blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, sat contentedly on a soft blanket his mother had spread near the counter. He played with a set of wooden blocks, occasionally babbling to himself in that mysterious language only babies understand, his chubby fingers exploring each block as if it held the secrets of the universe. The pharmacy was quiet that afternoon. The kind of peaceful quiet that made time seem to slow down and stretch like honey dripping from a spoon. Outside, the town moved at its usual unhurried pace, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant sound of children playing in the park 3 blocks away. Ethan reached for a small tin from the top shelf, his movements careful and deliberate as he brought it down to show Lily. It was a new herbal tea blend he had just received from a supplier who specialized in traditional remedies, and he wanted to know if she thought her mother might be interested in trying it. The conversation flowed naturally between them, the way conversations do between people who have known each other for years, punctuated by comfortable pauses and gentle laughter. Connor had been so quiet, so content with his blocks, that neither adult noticed when his attention shifted to something else entirely. A thin beam of afternoon light had found its way through the front window and created a pathway across the floor, leading directly to a door at the back of the store that stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. The storage room door was supposed to be closed, always closed and locked according to Ethan's strict routine, but somehow today it had been left open just a crack, just enough for a curious baby to notice. Connor's bright blue eyes fixed on that sliver of darkness with the intensity that only very young children possess when they discover something new and interesting. He abandoned his blocks without a second thought, and with the surprising speed that newly mobile babies sometimes display, he began crawling toward the mysterious opening. His little hands and knees moved in perfect coordination, carrying him silently across the smooth wooden floor, while his mother and Ethan continued their conversation about teas and remedies. The storage room beckoned like a cave full of treasures, and Connor, in his innocent curiosity, answered its call without hesitation. By the time Lily turned back to check on her son, ready to show him the pretty tin Ethan had brought down, her heart gave a sudden, sharp jump in her chest. The blanket was empty, the blocks scattered, and Connor was nowhere to be seen. Connor? Lily's voice carried a note of concern, but not yet panic. The way a mother's voice sounds when she expects her child to pop out from behind something any second, giggling at his clever hiding spot. She looked behind the counter, thinking perhaps he had crawled there while she wasn't watching, but found only dust bunnies and an old penny that had probably been there for months. Ethan immediately stopped what he was doing, his experienced eyes scanning the store with the efficiency of someone who knew every corner and hiding place. The pharmacy wasn't large, and there were only so many places a baby could go, but somehow Connor seemed to have vanished like morning mist. They checked behind the rotating display of reading glasses, looked under the small bench where customers sometimes sat to wait for prescriptions, even peered behind the old radiator that hadn't worked in years, but that Ethan kept meaning to have removed. With each empty spot they checked, Lily's concern grew stronger, transforming slowly into the beginnings of real worry. Then they heard it, a sound so unexpected that both adults froze in place, their heads turning toward the storage room door. It wasn't Connor's usual babbling or crying, but something else entirely, a soft, almost musical, cooing sound that seemed to come from two sources at once. Without speaking, Ethan moved toward the door with Lily close behind, her mother's instinct overriding any sense of caution. He pushed the door open slowly, and the hinges creaked in protest, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. What they saw inside that dimly lit storage room would remain etched in their memories forever. A moment so surreal and beautiful that it seemed to belong in a fairy tale rather than a Tuesday afternoon in a small-town pharmacy. Connor sat on the cool concrete floor, his tiny form illuminated by a shaft of light from a high window, and he wasn't alone. Next to him, close enough that their bodies touched, sat a small bear cub with fur the color of chocolate and honey mixed together. The cub couldn't have been more than a few months old, its eyes still holding that innocent, curious look that young animals share with human babies. The most extraordinary thing wasn't just that Connor had found a bear cub in the storage room, though that alone would have been enough to make anyone question their sanity. It was the way the two of them sat together, perfectly calm and content, as if they had known each other all their lives. Connor's chubby hand rested gently on the cub's head, patting it with the same careful tenderness he showed when petting the neighbor's old golden retriever. The cub, for its part, seemed to lean into the touch, its small body trembling slightly, but not from fear. It was the trembling of a creature that had been alone and scared, and had suddenly found comfort in the most unlikely of companions. Neither Lily nor Ethan could speak for several long moments, their minds struggling to process what their eyes were seeing. This wasn't supposed to happen, couldn't happen in the ordinary world they knew, yet here it was, happening right in front of them. As they stood frozen in the doorway, other details began to register in their shocked minds. The storage room, usually neat and organized with Ethan's pharmaceutical supplies and old records, showed signs of disturbance. A box of cotton balls had been knocked over, creating a small white cloud on the floor. Several bottles of cough syrup had rolled into a corner, and there were tiny paw prints in the dust that covered the old shelves. But there was no sign of violence or panic, no torn packages or broken glass. It was as if the cub had simply appeared there, lost and confused, but not aggressive. Lily's maternal instinct finally overcame her shock, and she took a careful step forward, ready to grab Connor if the cub showed any sign of danger. But the little bear just looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too intelligent, too knowing for a wild animal. Those eyes held a sadness that touched something deep in Lily's heart, the same sadness she sometimes saw in Connor's eyes when he woke from a bad dream. "Don't move too quickly," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure why he was whispering. Perhaps it was the strange, almost sacred quality of the moment that demanded quiet voices and gentle movements. He had lived in this town all his life, had heard stories of bears in the mountains 20 miles away. But never anything like this. Bears didn't just appear in locked storage rooms in the middle of town, especially not cubs this young without their mothers. Yet here one was, sitting with a human baby as if they were old friends meeting for afternoon tea. As they watched, Connor turned to look at them, his face breaking into the proud smile of a child who had just done something wonderful and wanted to share it with the adults he loved. He babbled something incomprehensible but clearly happy, his free hand waving at his mother while the other continued to pet the cub's soft fur. That's when Lily noticed it, a detail that made an already impossible situation even more mysterious. Around the cub's neck, tied with what looked like a leather cord, worn soft with age, hung a small wooden carving. She had to look closer to make out what it was, and when she did, her breath caught in her throat. It was a bird, carved with such delicate skill that you could see individual feathers despite its tiny size. The wood was smooth and polished, clearly handled often, and it seemed to glow with a warm patina in the dim light. This wasn't some random piece of debris the cub had gotten tangled in. This was deliberate, purposeful, placed there by human hands. Someone had cared for this cub, had marked it with this beautiful token, but who? And more importantly, why was it here in Ethan's storage room, being comforted by a 1-year-old baby? Ethan moved slowly around Lily, his movements careful and deliberate as he approached the unlikely pair. The cub watched him but showed no signs of aggression, no baring of teeth or defensive posturing. If anything, it seemed relieved to see more humans, as if it had been looking for people and had finally found them. Connor, delighted by all the attention, clapped his hands and made the happy gurgling sound that Lily knew meant he wanted to be picked up. She moved forward, no longer afraid but still cautious, and gently lifted her son into her arms. The cub made a small sound of protest, not quite a growl but more like a whimper, and tried to follow Connor up. Its little paws scrabbled against Lily's leg, not with claws extended, but with the same gentle touch a house cat might use when asking for attention. "What do we do?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she held Connor close. The baby reached toward the cub, clearly wanting to continue their newfound friendship, and she had to adjust her grip to keep him from wiggling free. Ethan stood there for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities and protocols. He should call animal control, or the police, or someone who would know what to do with a bear cub that had mysteriously appeared in his storage room. But something held him back, some instinct that told him this situation required a different approach. The cub didn't seem dangerous or sick. It seemed lost, yes, but also strangely purposeful, as if it had come here for a reason, and that wooden bird around its neck suggested a story that wouldn't be solved by simply calling the authorities and having the cub taken away. "Let me think," Ethan said, running a hand through his graying hair as he often did when faced with a puzzle. He looked around the storage room more carefully now, searching for clues about how the cub had gotten in. The door had been locked. He was certain of that. He had unlocked it himself just that morning to get supplies, and had locked it again afterward. It was part of his routine, as regular as breathing. The only other entrance was a window set high in the wall, but it had been boarded up years ago after a storm had cracked the glass. Except now, looking at it more closely, he could see that one of the boards was slightly askew, creating a gap just large enough for a small, determined creature to squeeze through. But the window was 8 feet off the ground. How had a baby bear cub managed to reach it, let alone get through it? The afternoon light was beginning to change, taking on the golden quality that meant evening was approaching. Through the main store windows, Ethan could see a few customers approaching, regulars who always stopped by at this time for their prescriptions or just to chat. He made a quick decision, one that surprised him even as he made it. "Bring Connor and the cub into the back office," he said to Lily. "Let me handle the customers and then we'll figure out what to do." Lily looked uncertain but nodded, understanding that whatever was happening here was too special, too strange to be handled in the usual way. She managed to coax the cub to follow her with Connor still in her arms, the baby reaching down toward his new friend and babbling encouragement. The cub padded after them on paws that seemed too big for its body, the wooden bird swinging gently with each step. The back office was Ethan's private space, filled with old photographs of the pharmacy through the decades, certificates and awards from the State Pharmaceutical Board, and a comfortable old couch where he sometimes took his lunch breaks. Lily sat down with Connor in her lap, and the cub immediately climbed up beside them, curling into a small ball with its head resting on Connor's leg. The baby patted the cub's head with obvious delight, and Lily found herself relaxing despite the surreal nature of the situation. There was something deeply peaceful about the cub, something that went beyond its gentle behavior. It was as if it carried an aura of calm with it, the kind of presence that made you want to speak in soft voices and move slowly, savoring each moment. Through the thin wall, she could hear Ethan greeting his customers with his usual warmth, his voice giving no hint of the extraordinary scene playing out in his back office. Mrs. Henderson was picking up her heart medication and wanted to tell him about her grandson's baseball game. Mr. Chen needed advice about vitamins for his elderly mother. The normal rhythm of small-town pharmacy life continued while in the back room. A baby and a bear cub dozed together in the golden afternoon light. Connor had fallen asleep with his hand still resting on the cub's fur, and the little bear's breathing had synchronized with his, their chests rising and falling in perfect harmony. Lily found herself studying the wooden bird more closely, noticing details she had missed before. There were tiny symbols carved into its wings, patterns that might have been decorative, or might have been something more meaningful. The leather cord was braided in an unusual pattern, and there was a small bead worked into it that looked like polished river stone. Time seemed to move differently in that back office, stretching and contracting like a living thing. Lily wasn't sure if minutes or hours had passed when she heard the front door's bell chime for the last time, followed by the sound of Ethan turning the lock and flipping the sign to closed. His footsteps approached slowly, and when he appeared in the doorway, his face held an expression of wonder mixed with concern. "I've been thinking," he said, settling into his desk chair with a creaking of old leather. "This isn't random. That cub didn't just wander in here by accident. Someone or something brought it here, to this specific place, at this specific time." He gestured toward the sleeping pair on the couch. "And look at them. Have you ever seen anything like it? It's like they recognize each other, like they were meant to meet." Lily nodded slowly, her hand unconsciously stroking Connor's hair as he slept. "The wooden bird," she said. "It means something. Someone cared enough about this cub to mark it, to make sure anyone who found it would know it wasn't just a wild animal." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he thought. "There are stories," he said slowly. "Old stories from when this town was first settled. Stories about people who lived in harmony with the forest, who had relationships with animals that went beyond what we understand today. My grandmother used to tell me about a man who lived at the edge of town, back in her childhood. She said he could speak to animals, that they would come to him when they were hurt or lost." He shook his head, smiling slightly at the memory. "I always thought they were just tales, the kind of stories people tell to make the world seem more magical than it really is." "Maybe they weren't just stories," Lily said softly, looking down at the sleeping cub. "Maybe some of that magic is still around, hiding in plain sight, waiting for moments like this to reveal itself." The idea should have seemed ridiculous, but sitting there in the fading light with a bear cub sleeping peacefully next to her baby, it felt entirely possible. The world was full of mysteries, after all, things that science couldn't quite explain, and logic couldn't quite grasp. Why shouldn't this be one of them? The cub stirred slightly in its sleep, making a small sound that was almost like a sigh, and Connor's hand tightened slightly on its fur as if offering comfort. The gesture was so natural, so instinctive, that it brought tears to Lily's eyes. Here was her baby, barely old enough to walk, already showing the kind of compassion that some people never developed in a lifetime. As if responding to some unspoken agreement, both adults settled in to wait. They didn't know what they were waiting for exactly, but they both felt that this story wasn't over, that there was more to come. Ethan made them tea using the hot plate he kept in the office, and they drank it in comfortable silence, watching the sleeping pair and occasionally exchanging glances of wonder. The storage room mystery gnawed at the back of their minds. How had the cub gotten up to that window? Why had it chosen this pharmacy, of all the buildings in town? And most importantly, who had tied that wooden bird around its neck? The questions multiplied with each passing moment, but neither of them felt anxious about finding answers. There was a sense that answers would come when they were meant to, that pushing too hard would break whatever spell had been cast over this strange afternoon. The sun was setting properly now, painting the office walls in shades of orange and pink that made everything look like it was wrapped in soft fabric. The cub woke first, its eyes blinking slowly as it remembered where it was. It looked at Connor, still sleeping peacefully, then at the two adults watching from across the room. There was something in its gaze that seemed almost grateful, as if it understood that these humans weren't going to hurt it, that it had found a safe place after what must have been a frightening journey. It began to clean itself with the same methodical care that a house cat might show, licking its paws and rubbing them over its face and ears. The wooden bird clinked softly against the floor with each movement, a gentle reminder of the mystery that surrounded this small creature. Connor woke moments later, his eyes immediately seeking out his furry friend. When he saw the cub was still there, his face lit up with pure joy, the kind of uncomplicated happiness that only very young children can achieve. He reached out to pet the cub again, and this time the little bear leaned into his touch, making a rumbling sound that was almost like purring. Lily had heard that bears could purr, though she'd never believed it until now. The sound was deeply comforting, vibrating through the air like a lullaby. She found herself thinking about all the walls humans built between themselves and the natural world, all the fears and assumptions that kept them from experiencing moments like this. Here was her baby, too young to have learned those fears, showing her what was possible when you approach the world with an open heart. Ethan's phone rang, startling everyone in the room. The cub's ears perked up, and Connor made a sound of protest at the interruption. Ethan looked at the caller ID and frowned. It was the town's sheriff, probably calling about something routine, but the timing seemed too coincidental. He let it go to voicemail, not ready to bring the outside world into this bubble of magic they had created. But the spell was breaking anyway. They could all feel it, the sense that something was about to change, that this peaceful interlude was coming to an end. The cub seemed to feel it too, becoming restless, padding over to the office door and sniffing at the crack underneath it. It made a low, whining sound, not distressed but expectant, as if it knew something the humans didn't. That's when they heard it, a soft knocking at the pharmacy's back door. Not the front door where customers entered, but the back door that Ethan used for deliveries, the door that opened onto the alley that ran behind the buildings on this block. The knock came again, gentle but insistent, and the cub's whining grew louder. It scratched at the office door, clearly wanting to go toward the sound. Ethan and Lily exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. This was it, the answer to their mystery, standing just outside and knocking politely rather than demanding entry. Ethan stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting for so long, and made his way through the pharmacy with Lily following, Connor in her arms, and the cub padding along beside them. The back door had a small window set high in it, but the alley beyond was dark, and Ethan couldn't see who was knocking. He hesitated for a moment, his hand on the deadbolt, wondering if he was about to let danger into his safe, orderly world. But the cub was pressing against his leg now, making excited little sounds, and somehow that gave him courage. He turned the lock and opened the door, and found himself looking at a man who seemed to have stepped out of another time. He was elderly, but stood straight and tall, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of forest moss. His clothes were simple but well made, and he carried a walking stick that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of oak. But it was his expression that struck Ethan most forcefully, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and deep sadness that made him look like a man who had lost something precious and feared he might never find it again. "I believe," the man said, in a voice that was soft but carried clearly in the evening air, "that you have found my friend." His eyes moved past Ethan to the cub, and his weathered face transformed with joy. The cub let out a sound that was definitely recognition, rushing forward to press against the man's legs, its whole body wiggling with happiness. The man knelt slowly, his joints creaking audibly, and gathered the cub into his arms with the tenderness of a parent reuniting with a child. The wooden bird swung free as he lifted the cub, catching the light from the pharmacy's back door, and the man touched it gently, his fingers tracing the carved feathers with obvious familiarity. "Thank you," he said, looking up at Ethan and Lily with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Thank you for keeping her safe." The man introduced himself as Jacob Bennett, though he said most folks who knew him called him Jake. He lived in a cabin at the very edge of town, where the houses gave way to forest, and the modern world seemed to fade into something older and wilder. The cub, he explained, was named Avery, and she wasn't exactly a pet, but wasn't exactly wild either. He had found her as a tiny cub, orphaned and near death, the previous spring. Her mother had been killed, though he didn't say how, and Avery would have died too if he hadn't taken her in. He had bottle-fed her, kept her warm, taught her to forage and fish the way her mother would have. The wooden bird was something he had carved during the long nights when Avery was sick and he wasn't sure she would survive. It was meant to be a promise, he said, a promise that she would fly free one day, that she would grow strong and return to the wild where she belonged. But Avery had other ideas. Even as she grew stronger and more independent, she chose to stay close to Jake's cabin, coming and going as she pleased, but always returning. She would sleep on his porch on cold nights, follow him when he went gathering herbs and mushrooms in the forest, sit beside him while he carved wood in the evenings. They had developed a friendship that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Jake didn't try to make her into a pet, didn't put a collar on her or keep her in a cage. He simply accepted her presence in his life as a gift, and she seemed to feel the same way about him. The wooden bird was the only thing he had given her to wear, and only so that if she ever got lost, whoever found her would know she was loved and cared for. Today had been a disaster of miscommunication and bad timing. Jake had been gathering special herbs that only grew in a particular spot deep in the forest. Herbs he used to make medicines that he shared freely with anyone in town who needed them. Avery usually stayed close when he was working, but something had spooked her. Probably the sound of logging trucks on the nearby mountain road. She had run, and in her panic, she'd gotten turned around, lost in a part of the forest she didn't know. Jake had searched for hours, calling her name, following tracks that led nowhere, his heart growing heavier with each passing minute. He had finally returned to town, hoping someone might have seen her, and that's when he noticed that the pharmacy's back window, the one that faced the forest, had been disturbed. "She must have climbed the old oak that grows against your building," Jake explained, stroking Avery's fur as she dozed in his arms. When she's scared, she climbs. It's instinct. She probably saw the gap in the boards and squeezed through, looking for somewhere safe to hide. He shook his head in wonder. But how she knew to come here, to this place where kind people would find her and keep her safe, that's beyond my understanding. Animals know things we don't. Feel things we've forgotten how to feel. Maybe she sensed something about this place, about you folks, that told her she would be okay here. Connor had been watching the reunion with rapt attention, and now he reached out toward Avery, making the babbling sounds that meant he wanted to say goodbye properly. Jake smiled and knelt again, bringing Avery close enough for Connor to pat her head one more time. The cub nuzzled against the baby's hand, and for a moment, the two of them seemed to be communicating in some wordless language that the adults couldn't quite grasp. It was beautiful and mysterious and somehow perfect. A reminder that the connections between living things didn't always need words or explanations. Sometimes, simple presence and gentle touch were enough. As Jake prepared to leave, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into Lily's hand. It was another wooden carving, this one of a bear cub so detailed and lifelike that she gasped. "For the little one," Jake said, nodding toward Connor. "So he remembers that magic is real, that friendship can happen in the most unexpected places." He adjusted Avery in his arms, preparing for the walk home. But before he left, he turned back one more time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "there are those who would say this was all coincidence. That Avery just randomly ended up in your storage room and your boy just happened to find her. But I've lived long enough to know better. Some meetings are meant to be, written in the stars or the earth or wherever such things are written. Your boy and Avery were meant to meet today, meant to show us all something about innocence and trust, and the bridges that can be built between different worlds." After Jake and Avery disappeared into the growing darkness, Ethan, Lily, and Connor stood in the doorway for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. The pharmacy felt different somehow, as if the presence of the cub and the visit from Jake had changed it in some fundamental way. It was still the same building with the same shelves and the same familiar smells, but now it carried an additional layer of meaning, a secret history that only they knew. Connor was holding his new wooden bear, examining it with the serious concentration of a baby discovering something important. The carving was warm from Jake's pocket, and it seemed to pulse with life in Connor's small hands. "We should tell people," Lily said eventually, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "This is amazing. People should know that things like this can happen." But even as she said it, she knew they wouldn't, not really. They would mention it to a few close friends, perhaps, but the full story would remain theirs, a secret treasure to be taken out and examined in quiet moments. Some experiences were too precious, too fragile to be shared widely. They would break under the weight of skepticism and rational explanation, losing their magic in the telling. This afternoon would live in their memories, perfect and untouchable, a reminder that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than most people ever realized. Ethan locked the back door carefully, checking it twice out of habit, then walked them to the front of the store. The evening had fully arrived now, streetlights beginning to flicker on and the sounds of the town settling into its nighttime rhythm. As Lily strapped Connor into his car seat, the baby held up his wooden bear to show Ethan, babbling excitedly in his mysterious language. Ethan reached out and touched the carving gently, feeling the smooth wood and the careful craftsmanship that had gone into creating it. "You take good care of that," he told Connor seriously, as if the baby could understand every word. That's not just a toy. That's a memory, a piece of magic that you'll carry with you always, even if you don't remember the details of today when you're older. Lily drove home slowly, taking the long way that wound past the edge of town where Jake lived. She couldn't see his cabin from the road, but she could see the forest that surrounded it, dark and mysterious in the gathering night. Somewhere in there, an old man and a young bear were probably settling in for the evening, two unlikely friends who had found each other against all odds. Connor had fallen asleep in his car seat, clutching his wooden bear, and Lily found herself thinking about the world he would grow up in. Would he remember this day? Would some part of him always know that he had once sat with a bear cub in perfect harmony, that he had been part of something magical and unexplainable? When they got home, Lily's husband Michael was waiting, dinner on the table and questions in his eyes about why they were so late. Lily tried to explain, but the words felt inadequate, unable to capture the wonder of what they had experienced. Michael listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a fanciful story, nodding in all the right places but clearly not quite believing. It didn't matter, Lily realized. He didn't need to believe. The experience belonged to her and Connor and Ethan, a secret bond that connected them to something larger than their ordinary lives. She put Connor to bed, still clutching his wooden bear, and as she watched him sleep, she made a promise to herself to always remember this day, to hold on to the feeling of magic and possibility that it had brought into their lives. Back at the pharmacy, Ethan stood in his storage room with a flashlight, examining the window more carefully. The boards had definitely been disturbed, pushed aside just enough to create a gap, but there were no tool marks, no signs of human interference. Just the scuff marks of small claws and a few tufts of brown fur caught on the rough wood. He thought about fixing it immediately, boarding it up properly so nothing like this could happen again. But something stopped him. Instead, he simply adjusted the board slightly, making sure they were secure but leaving just enough give that if another scared, lost creature needed sanctuary, they might find it here. It was foolish, perhaps, and certainly not standard pharmacy protocol, but after today, standard seemed less important than it once had. He turned off the lights and locked up, but instead of going straight home, he found himself walking toward the edge of town, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The forest loomed dark and inscrutable, full of secrets and stories that most people would never know. Somewhere in there, Jake and Avery were probably sharing their evening meal, two souls who had found each other across the vast divide that supposedly separated human from animal. Ethan stood there for a long moment, breathing in the pine-scented air and listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl hooted in the distance, and something rustled in the underbrush, but he felt no fear, only a deep sense of connection to the living world around him. As he walked back toward town, Ethan thought about the customers who would come to his pharmacy tomorrow, looking for remedies for their various ailments. He would help them as he always did, measuring out pills and offering advice, but now he would carry with him the knowledge that sometimes the best medicine wasn't found in bottles or prescriptions. Sometimes it came in the form of unexpected encounters, moments of pure magic that reminded you that life was more than just routines and responsibilities. The bear cub in his storage room had been a prescription of sorts, a cure for the blindness that came from living too much in the ordinary world and forgetting about the extraordinary one that existed alongside it. The next morning arrived crisp and bright, and Ethan opened his pharmacy at the usual time, everything seemingly back to normal. But throughout the day he found himself glancing at the storage room door, half expecting to hear that soft cooing sound again. Lily stopped by with Connor in the afternoon, supposedly to pick up vitamins, but really just to confirm that yesterday had actually happened. Connor immediately crawled toward the storage room, babbling excitedly, and they had to gently redirect him. The wooden bear never left his hands, and several customers commented on how beautiful it was, asking where Lily had gotten it. She just smiled and said it was a gift from a friend, which was true enough. Word spread, as word always does in small towns, though the story got distorted in the telling. Some people heard that a bear had broken into the pharmacy and terrorized everyone until animal control came. Others heard that Ethan had been secretly keeping exotic pets in his storage room. But a few people, the ones who still believed in magic and mystery, heard something closer to the truth, and came by the pharmacy just to stand in the place where something wonderful had happened. Ethan could always tell these people by the way they looked around with soft, wondering eyes, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever magic still lingered in the air. About a week later, Jake came by the pharmacy during the quiet hour after lunch. He moved slowly, as if his joints hurt more than usual, and Ethan noticed he was carrying a small cloth bag. "Thought you might like these," Jake said, setting the bag on the counter. Inside were several small jars of homemade salve, each one carefully labeled in spidery handwriting. "Made from the herbs I was gathering that day, good for aches and pains, both the physical kind and the other kind." Ethan didn't ask what the other kind was. He thought he knew. The ache of living in a world that sometimes felt too small, too ordinary, too disconnected from the wild magic that still existed if you knew where to look. They talked for a while about simple things, the weather, the upcoming harvest festival, the new family that had moved in down the street. But underneath the ordinary conversation was an understanding, a recognition between two men who had witnessed something extraordinary and been changed by it. Before Jake left, he paused at the door and looked back. "Avery asks about the boy sometimes," he said with a small smile. "Not in words, of course, but I can tell. She remembers him. Animals don't forget kindness, especially the pure kind that comes from babies who haven't learned to be afraid yet." He adjusted his walking stick and stepped out into the afternoon sun. "If you ever want to bring him by for a visit, you're welcome. Both of you are." Ethan thought about that invitation often over the following weeks. He imagined Connor growing up with Avery as a friend, learning about the forest and its creatures from Jake, developing a connection to the natural world that most children never got to experience. It was a beautiful thought, but also a complicated one. The world had rules and expectations, and a friendship between a boy and a bear cub pushed against those boundaries in ways that made people uncomfortable. But then again, hadn't the most important moments in life always been the ones that challenged what people thought was possible? One evening, as autumn began to paint the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, Lily brought Connor by the pharmacy just before closing. She had made a decision, she said, and wanted Ethan to be part of it. They drove together to the edge of town, following the narrow dirt road that led toward Jake's cabin. The forest was alive with the sounds of evening, birds calling their good nights, and small creatures rustling through the fallen leaves. Jake's cabin appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. Avery was on the porch, bigger now than she had been that day in the pharmacy, but still small for a bear. When she saw the car, she stood up on her hind legs, and even from a distance they could see her excitement. Connor practically vibrated with joy when he saw Avery, reaching out with both hands and making the happy sounds that meant he wanted to get closer. Jake came out of the cabin, moving slowly but smiling broadly, and helped them navigate the introduction carefully. Avery was gentle, sniffing Connor curiously, and then settling down beside him on the porch as if they had never been apart. The baby and the bear cub sat together in the fading light. Connor babbling his mysterious stories, while Avery listened with what looked remarkably like patience. Jake brought out tea for the adults, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching this impossible friendship unfold before their eyes. "She won't be able to stay much longer," Jake said quietly, his eyes on Avery. "She's growing fast, and soon her instincts will call her back to the wild where she belongs. But for now, for these precious months, she's choosing to stay." He sipped his tea thoughtfully. "I think she was waiting to see the boy again, to make sure he was okay. Animals have their own kind of honor, their own debts and gratitudes. She knows he was kind to her when she was scared and lost, and that matters to her in ways we probably can't fully understand." They visited several more times as autumn deepened into winter, always in the evening when the pharmacy was closed and the forest was quiet. Each time, the bond between Connor and Avery seemed to grow stronger, built on some foundation that existed beyond language or logic. Connor learned to move slowly and gently around Avery, and she learned that his grabbing hands meant affection, not threat. Jake taught them both about the forest, showing Connor which berries were safe to eat and teaching Avery new fishing spots along the creek. It was an education unlike anything Connor would get in school, lessons about respect and connection, and the deep magic that linked all living things. The last visit came on a snowy evening in early December. Avery was notably bigger, her fur thick and glossy with winter growth, and there was something different in her manner, a restlessness that hadn't been there before. Jake looked sad but accepting, the expression of someone preparing to say goodbye to a dear friend. "It's time," he said simply, and somehow they all understood. Avery was ready to return to the wild, to become the bear she was meant to be. The wooden bird still hung around her neck, but Jake removed it gently, pressing it into Connor's small hand. "She doesn't need it anymore," he explained. "She knows who she is now, knows she was loved. That's all the mark she needs to carry into the world." Connor seemed to understand in his baby way that this was goodbye. He patted Avery's head one last time, then surprised everyone by leaning forward and placing a gentle kiss on her nose. Avery made a soft rumbling sound, that purr-like noise they had heard that first day in the pharmacy, and nuzzled against Connor briefly before turning and walking into the forest. She paused once at the tree line, looking back at them all, and then disappeared into the snowy darkness. They waited for a while, hoping she might return, but Jake shook his head. "When they go, he said. "It's the way it needs to be. We were blessed to have her for as long as we did." The drive back to town was quiet, Connor sleeping in his car seat with both wooden carvings clutched in his hands. The bear and the bird, symbols of a friendship that had transcended every boundary humans like to put between themselves and the wild world. Lily found herself crying, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming beauty of what they had witnessed over these past months. Her son, barely more than a baby, had experienced something that most people would never believe, had touched a kind of magic that the modern world insisted didn't exist. He might not remember the details when he was older, but she believed that something of this experience would stay with him, shaping him in subtle ways throughout his life. Ethan returned to his pharmacy, locking the door carefully behind him and standing for a moment in the darkness. The storage room door was closed, the window properly boarded now that its purpose had been served. But the pharmacy felt different, charged with the memory of that extraordinary afternoon when a bear cub had hidden among the medicine bottles and a baby had shown them all what fearless love looked like. He thought about all the customers who came through his door, seeking remedies for their ailments, and wondered how many of them were really looking for something else, some kind of magic or meaning that couldn't be found in a prescription bottle. maybe that was the real lesson of Avery's visit, that healing came in many forms. And sometimes the best medicine was simply an open heart and the willingness to believe in impossible things. Winter settled over the town like a thick blanket, muffling sounds and turning the world into something hushed and ethereal. Jake still came by the pharmacy occasionally, bringing his herbal remedies and staying to chat about everything and nothing. He never mentioned Avery directly, but sometimes Ethan caught him looking toward the forest with an expression of such longing that it made his chest ache. The old man was lonelier now, without his unusual companion, but he seemed at peace with it, understanding that love sometimes meant letting go, allowing the beloved to become what they were meant to be. Spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal, and with it came news that made everyone's heart lift. A hiker had spotted a young bear near the creek that ran through the forest, a bear with unusual markings and no fear of humans. The bear had watched the hiker for a long moment before disappearing into the trees, and the hiker swore that the bear had been wearing something around its neck, though they couldn't see what. Jake smiled when he heard the story, the first real smile anyone had seen from him in months. "She's doing well," he said simply. "Living her life, but remembering her friends. That's all we can ask for, isn't it?" Connor was walking now, toddling around the pharmacy when Lily brought him to visit, always drawn to the storage room door as if he remembered what had happened there. He still carried his wooden carvings everywhere, the bear and the bird that had become his most treasured possessions. Sometimes Lily caught him talking to them in his developing language, telling them stories that she couldn't quite understand but that seemed very important to him. She wondered what he would think when he was older, and she told him the real story behind his beloved toys. Would he believe her? Would it matter if he didn't? The magic had happened, whether he remembered it or not, had woven itself into the fabric of who he was becoming. One day in late spring, Ethan was organizing the storage room when he found something that made his breath catch. There, in the corner where Avery had huddled that first day, was a small tuft of brown fur, somehow overlooked in all the cleaning since then. He picked it up carefully, feeling its softness between his fingers, and was transported back to that afternoon when the impossible had walked through his door. He thought about keeping it, preserving it as proof that it had all really happened, but something told him that wasn't right. Instead, he walked to the back door, opened it to the warm spring air, and let the wind take the fur, watching it drift away toward the forest where it belonged. That night, he had a dream, though it felt more like a memory or perhaps a glimpse of something happening far away. In the dream, a young bear stood by a creek in moonlight, strong and healthy and free. Around her neck was not a wooden bird, but a collar of wildflowers, placed there by no human hand, but woven by the forest itself in recognition of a creature that had bridged two worlds. The bear looked directly at him in the dream, and in her intelligent eyes he saw recognition, gratitude, and something else. A promise, perhaps, that the magic they had shared was not gone but had simply taken a new form, spreading out into the world like ripples on water. Summer came with its long days and warm nights, and the town settled into its usual rhythms. But for those who had been part of Avery's story, the world remained touched with wonder. They saw it in small things, the way Connor would stop and watch squirrels with unusual intensity, as if he could understand their chittering conversations, the way Jake's garden grew more lush and vibrant than ever before, as if the plants knew they were tended by someone who understood the deep connections between all living things. The way Ethan's pharmacy became known as a place where people felt better just by walking in, even before they got their medicine, as if the building itself remembered the magic that had once sheltered there. One evening, as summer was beginning to hint at autumn, Lily was putting Connor to bed when he said his first really clear sentence. He held up his wooden bear and said, "Bear friend, come back." Lily's heart stopped for a moment, wondering if he somehow remembered, if some part of that magical afternoon had stayed with him despite his young age. But then he smiled and hugged the carving close, settling into sleep with the contentment of a child who knew he was loved and safe. Maybe he remembered, maybe he didn't. Maybe it didn't matter. The important thing was that he had experienced it, had been part of something extraordinary, had learned before he could even properly talk that the world was full of wonders. Years passed, as years do, and Connor grew into a thoughtful, gentle child with an unusual affinity for animals. Dogs that barked at everyone else would calm in his presence. Cats that hid from strangers would curl up in his lap. Birds would land unusually close to him in the garden, as if recognizing something in him that made him safe. Lily never pushed the story of Avery on him, but she kept the wooden carvings safe, and sometimes she would catch him looking at them with an expression of deep concentration, as if trying to remember something just out of reach. When he was 5, old enough to understand but young enough to still believe in magic, she finally told him the whole story. Connor listened with wide eyes, occasionally touching the wooden bear and bird that sat between them on the kitchen table. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I think I remember her. Not with my head, but with my heart. Is that possible?" Lily pulled him close, breathing in the little boy smell of dirt and sunshine, and something indefinably sweet. "I think that's the only way to really remember the important things," she told him, "with your heart." He nodded solemnly, then asked if they could visit Jake. The old man was still living at the edge of the forest, still making his remedies and living his quiet life, and Lily thought it was time. Jake was older now, moving more slowly, but his eyes still held that spark of someone who had seen wonders and never forgotten them. He welcomed Connor like an old friend, showing him around his garden and teaching him about the different plants and their uses. As the sun was setting, Jake led them to a spot at the edge of his property where the forest began. He pointed to a large oak tree with distinctive claw marks rising up its trunk. "She comes by sometimes," he said quietly. "Not close anymore, she's too wild for that now. But I see her watching from the trees, checking on things. She's got cubs of her own now, teaching them about the world. I like to think she tells them about the kind humans who helped her once, about a baby who showed her that not all people are to be feared." Connor stood very still, looking into the darkening forest with the intensity of someone trying to see beyond the physical world into something deeper. Then, so quietly that the adults almost missed it, he began to hum. It wasn't any recognizable tune, just a low, gentle sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. After a moment, Jake joined in, harmonizing in a way that made the simple sound into something hauntingly beautiful. They stood there as darkness fell, 3 humans making music for a forest that might or might not be listening, connected by a story that had begun with a scared cub in a pharmacy storage room and had grown into something larger, a testament to the bridges that could be built between worlds when hearts were open and fear was set aside. As they drove home that night, Connor fell asleep in the back seat, clutching his wooden animals. Lily caught Ethan's eye in the rearview mirror. He had joined them for this visit, and saw her own thoughts reflected there. They had been part of something extraordinary, something that had changed them all in ways they were still discovering. The rational world would say it was just a lucky encounter with a tame bear cub, nothing more. But they knew better. They knew that magic was real, that it lived in the spaces between heartbeats. In the moment when a baby's hand touched wild fur without fear, in the decision to trust rather than panic, in the choice to see wonder rather than danger. The story of Avery spread quietly through the town over the years, becoming one of those local legends that everyone knew but no one quite believed. It changed in the telling, as stories do, sometimes becoming more dramatic, sometimes more mystical, but always carrying at its heart the truth that something wonderful had happened in Marshall's pharmacy that day. Children would dare each other to sneak into the storage room, hoping to find their own magic. Teenagers would use it as a metaphor for the possibility of unexpected connections. Adults would remember it when they needed to believe that the world still held surprises. Connor grew up to become a veterinarian, surprising no one who knew his story. He had a particular gift with frightened animals, able to calm them with a touch and a soft word. He never forgot the wooden bear and bird, keeping them on a shelf in his office where young patients could see them. Sometimes a child would ask about them, and he would tell them a story about a brave baby and a scared bear cub who became friends one magical afternoon. Most assumed it was just a fairy tale, but occasionally a child would listen with that particular intensity that suggested they knew truth when they heard it. These were the children who would grow up to protect wild places, to speak for creatures that had no voice, to remember that the division between human and nature was an illusion that could be dissolved by love. Jake lived to be 93, spending his last years telling stories to anyone who would listen about his life at the edge of the wild. He claimed that Avery visited him the night before he died, standing at the edge of his garden with her own cubs, now grown, beside her. He said she looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the forest, and he knew it was her way of saying goodbye. Whether this was true or the fantasy of a dying man, no one could say, but at his funeral, 3 large bears were spotted at the forest edge, watching the proceedings from a safe distance before melting back into the trees. Ethan kept the pharmacy running for another decade before retiring, passing it on to a young pharmacist who promised to maintain its character. On his last day, he stood in the storage room, remembering. The window had long since been properly repaired, the floor cleaned and reorganized countless times, but he swore he could still feel something of that afternoon lingering in the air. He left a note for the new owner, tucked behind a loose board, telling the story of Avery, and suggesting that if another scared creature ever needed sanctuary, perhaps the pharmacy could provide it once again. He didn't know if the note would ever be found, or if it would matter if it was, but it felt important to leave some record, some invitation for magic to return. The town continued to grow and change, new buildings rising where old ones had stood. The forest pushed back a little more each year, but the story of Avery persisted, adapted for each new generation. A reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary things could happen. Children still played baby and bear, pretending to be Connor and Avery meeting for the first time. Artists painted murals depicting the scene in various interpretations. Writers tried to capture it in words, though none ever quite managed to convey the simple wonder of that original moment when a baby's hand touched wild fur without fear. Connor, now Dr. Marshall, often thought about Avery when he was treating injured wildlife. He wondered if any of the bears he helped were her descendants, carrying some genetic memory of human kindness. He had tried many times to find her in the forest, hiking the old trails and calling softly, but she never showed herself to him as an adult. Perhaps that was as it should be. Their moment had been perfect in its innocence, a meeting of 2 young souls before the world had taught them to be afraid of each other. To try to recapture it would be to diminish it. Better to carry it forward as a reminder of what was possible when fear was set aside and love was allowed to bridge the gap between worlds. One spring day, nearly 20 years after that first encounter, Connor was called to help with an injured bear cub found by the roadside. The cub was young, scared, and hurt, but not badly. As Connor approached slowly, speaking in soft tones, the cub did something unexpected. Instead of cowering or trying to flee, it reached out one small paw toward him, as if asking for help. Connor's breath caught as he gently took that paw, feeling the same electric connection he imagined he had felt all those years ago. He couldn't know if this cub was related to Avery, couldn't know if bears passed down stories the way humans did. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the connection was still there. The bridge between human and wild still crossable for those brave enough to take the first step. He treated the cub with all the skill he had learned over the years, but also with something more, the tenderness that came from understanding that every creature was someone's Avery, deserving of compassion and respect. When the cub was healed and ready to return to the wild, Connor released it at the edge of the forest near where Jake's cabin had stood. The cabin was gone now, reclaimed by the forest, but Connor liked to think that something of Jake's spirit remained, watching over the creatures he had loved. The cub disappeared into the underbrush without looking back, which was as it should be. Wild things belonged to the wild. But Connor stood there for a long time afterward, holding his wooden bear and bird, remembering a pharmacy storage room and a moment when the impossible became possible.